both use the word whenever. They are uh, triggered abilities. Tooth and Nail has Entwine, which is an optional additional cost that you can choose to pay to change the effect of the spell. Sir Eleonora imposes an optional cost on opponent, a non-optional cost on opponent spells. Night's Whisper does not have a cost of paying life. The losing life is part of the effect of the spell, not part of the cost. Now, there is a very important distinction here between those as to why I am distinguishing between costs and triggers. Here's a couple of cards. Two dragons. One, Terror of the Peak says spells your opponents cast that target Terror of the Peak cost an additional 3 life to cast. The other says that when a dragon, including itself, becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, uh, it deals 3 damage to that player. You cannot pay more of a resource than you currently have. You cannot play more mana, you cannot play more life, you cannot sacrifice more creatures than you have available to do it. The only exception to this, there's a specific rule saying that you can draw more cards than are in your library. Usually you don't want to, but sometimes there's a Laboratory Maniac on the board. But effects can take more than you have. So if you are at 2 life, one of these dragons is going to kill you, and one of these dragons is going to get you a warning for a GRV. Which of the dragons will kill you? The answer, of course, is the one that's dealing damage. If you accidentally target Terror of the Peaks at 2 life, the judge will issue you a warning, but then will back up the game because you were not able to make a choice that involves paying more life than you have. A quick note about applying additional costs. Additional costs happen at step F, 601.2F of spellcasting. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens, but the most important relevant other step here is 601.2B, which is where you choose your modes, your optional additions, your alternatives, your X values. You make a whole bunch of choices, and then later you apply the additional costs. Another thing to note is that you are going to apply additional costs before you apply cost reduction. So a cost reduction that might not apply to the base spell might find something to reduce after you've added something to it. And finally, again, I mentioned this before, I'm going to mention it again, and I'm going to mention it again. This is one that is one of the most common judge calls you will get on this topic. They affect the total cost of the spell, but do not affect the mana value, which is the newly introduced as a Strixhaven term for converted mana cost of the spell. So, quick example here. Lightning Axe has an additional cost. You can either discard a card or pay 5 to cast it. It doesn't matter what you are doing, whether you are paying 1 mana and a card or paying 6 mana. Disdainful Stroke will never target it. Its CMC will always be 1. All right. So now we've got a little bit of a quiz. The board state is casting Skeletal Scrying for X equals 1 when you control Blood Funnel. Your opponent has a God Pharaoh statue and a Raydane. What is the total cost that you need to pay for the Skeletal Scrying? Take a second, do some math, let me know what you think. Bear in mind, I'm seeing a bunch of people saying 1B. Total cost is not mana cost. Total cost is all costs that you need to pay. Not Kevin has got it. Um, we start with 1 in a black, add God Pharaoh statue to that first because increases happen first. That takes it to 3 in a black. It doesn't matter that it costs 3 in a black. Its mana value is still 2. Raidane does not affect it. Once you've added 2, now there is 2 to clear, and the blood funnel cancels it out. The only additional cost beyond mana is exiling cards on Skeletal Scrying. Losing life is not a cost. Sacrificing creatures are not costs. One of those is an effect, one is a triggered ability. Nicely done. Uh, good job to everyone who got it. Any questions on that topic before we move on? Looks like no one's typing. So let's go and talk alternative costs now. An alternative cost is a cost that a spell's controller may pay rather than paying the spell's mana cost. This is in section 118.9 of the rules. Again, you shouldn't need that for today's presentation, but it's a good section to know about. You can take a peek and read through it yourself at a later date if you have questions. An important thing to remember is that casting X without paying its mana cost is an alternative cost. It is functionally the same as saying you may pay 0 rather than pay its mana cost. And as with last time, where I hammered home that one point of it doesn't affect total cost, doesn't affect total cost, doesn't affect mana cost, doesn't affect mana cost, doesn't affect mana cost. The one that you're going to see a lot here, one that you will get a lot of questions on in events, one that I'm going to quiz you on a couple of times is that you can only apply one alternative cost to a given spell. Finally, though, that mana cost thing does also apply to alternative costs. The actual mana value, the mana cost of a spell is what is printed in the corner of that card. The alternative doesn't affect that. Alternative costs can come once again from multiple different places, much like additional costs. They can be just printed in the rules text. Force of will is one of the most classic examples. Its cost is paying life and exiling a blue card. You get to pay it without mana. It is an absolute staple of every format it is legal in. Some keyword abilities will have alternative costs. The majority of alternative costs that you see are going to be in the form of keyword abilities. Keyworded abilities with alternate costs almost always have additional rules baggage with them. There are some conditions or some effects that they have beyond the ordinary casting of the spell. Flashback, in this case, is a few things tied together. It's an alternate cost. It changes where you can cast it from, namely the graveyard, and it changes what happens to the spell when it resolves. It gets exiled. Continuous effects from spells and abilities. Some of these are one-shots that have a short duration. Others are going to be from permanents with static abilities. Fist of the Suns, we're going to come back to a couple of times in this presentation. It's a super fun card. It says you can pay Wooburg rather than the mana cost for any spells that you cast. It was the Infinity Gauntlet before the Infinity Gauntlet was cool. And finally, as I mentioned before, anything that lets you cast spells for free does count as an alternative cost. So let's talk about what this all means together. Once again, I reiterate, only one alternative cost at a time, so I've got a combination of cards here. Snapcaster Mage and Force of Will. Respond in the chat with either a smiley face or a frowny face, based on how you think these cards interact. I'm seeing a few frowns. Those are correct. Billy, I am aware that the Infinity Gauntlet predates the Fist of the Suns, but it wasn't cool back then. It wasn't cool until it was in the movies. Yes, I'm a comics philistine. Uh, with this one, we are going to give it a flashback cost of 3 blue, so you can cast Force of Will for a total of 7 mana, but you cannot spend 2 mana and a blue card. Those are two alternate costs. You cannot apply both of them. Another thing to remember, if an X is not included in an alternate cost, then the X in the mana cost is going to be 0. So once again, we have a combination of two cards. There's Fist of the Suns again, and Perforos's intervention. Make an appropriate face in the chat. Once again, some frowny faces, and those are correct. If you cast this, you will have no effect. You will either create a 0/1 red elemental or deal 0 damage if you pay this for Wooburg. Some alternative costs change a card's characteristic, or to be more technically accurate, include rules that result in a change to the card's characteristics. There are currently, that I can think of, 2 of them, Bestow and Morph. And when you pick that alternate mode, anything that applies to whatever the spell turns into. For example, here's a combination. Let me know if you think it works. We have Sigarda's Aid, which says you can cast aura and equipment and spells as though they had flash. You have Eidolon of Countless Battles, which is a creature, but it has Bestow, which means that sometimes it's an aura. And some folks are smiling, and that is correct. If you choose to pay the alternate cost for Bestow, then it is an aura, and that means things that affect aura spells affect it. Eidolon of Countless Battles will have flash. This is covered in 601.3. There's a few specific callouts for flash and other things, but that is generally the case. And then the last one to remember is that additional costs can be paid if you are given the option to pay them. They must be paid if you are not given an option to pay them if they are required. So here is a combination of cards. We're back to Fist of the Suns again, letting cast Wooburg rather than the mana cost for spells. And we have Final Payment, which is white and a black, destroy target creature as an additional cost, either sacrifice a creature or pay 5 life. Is this a happy combo or a sad combo? People are sad. They are correct. Using the Fist of the Suns will only add mana to the cost, making it cost 5 instead of 2. It will not escape the additional cost printed on the card. So, quick little quiz here. Underworld Breach, a card that was banned out of Legacy, a staple of competitive EDH decks, gives an alternative cost to cards in your graveyard. That is an escape cost that's equal to their mana cost plus 3 other cards in your graveyard. I'm going to present you 4 cards and a certain choice that you would make for each of those cards, which are legal and which are illegal to cast out of the graveyard with Underworld Breach. I'll let you have another 15 or 20 seconds to take a look at these cards, think about what is going to work and what isn't, and then we'll cover the answers. Not Kevin says Bubble Snare and Deadly Alliance are legal, and that Erebos' Intervention and Snapdax are not. Any different thoughts? Up Ryan says happy, sad, happy, happy. And Kevin has corrected himself to the correct answer, which is that Erebos' intervention is legal. So for Erebos' intervention, what we said was that if there is no X in the alternate cost, X is zero. But in this case, the alternate cost equals the mana cost. It does have an X, and that means that choosing an X is correct. Mutate is an alternate cost. Escape is an alternate cost. Those are not compatible. Bubble Snare is an additional cost. You can pay an additional cost and stack it onto an alternate cost. And then the discount on Deadly Alliance is just a cost reduction. It is part of the spell. It applies to any cost you pay for it. It is not an alternate. I'll take a quick pause for questions here. Seems like we're mostly good. So let's talk about the things that aren't alternative costs, the ones we might call alternate, but that aren't that as defined by the rules. They're specifically not covered by that section 118.9. Um, Notably, I call these out because all of these quote unquote alternates can be combined with a single alternative cost. So, in terms of what does and does not stack together, this is why we are separating them into actual alternatives and the ones with scare quotes. We're going to start off with color washing, which isn't a technical term. I think that is what people call it. They might have different words for it. A lot of borrow effects nowadays are printed with a text. You may spend mana as though it were mana of any type to cast that spell. This is not an alternate cost. So here we have a combination of three cards. Gonti steals something or other from an opponent, hopefully something big and expensive. Cabal Ritual adds 5 black mana to your mana pool. Fist of the Suns, we've seen before, Wooburg rather than pay cost. Are we looking at a happy or sad interaction here? Smiley face, we've got a combo. We can absolutely spend black, 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 black as though it were white, blue, black, red, green to cast the alternate cost. The alternate cost and the color washing are compatible because color washing is not an alternative. Similar to this, mana substitutes. There are a few ways uh, to pay things other than mana for the mana cost of a spell. Convoke, Delve, Improvise, Phyrexian Mana, and one specific other card that I'm aware of um, uh, can substitute other resources for mana payment. So this is more less of a rules thing and more of a trivia thing. Can anyone name the one other card? It is Crick. Crick says that for each black mana and a cost, you can pay 2 life rather than pay the mana. And here we've got Drill Bit, which has Spectacle, an alternate cost from Return to Ravnica. It is a cost that you can pay when an opponent has lost life this turn. Are we looking at a happy or a sad combination? Once again, pretty simple. Drill Bit Spectacle Cost is an alternate cost. Crick's ability is a replacement ability. It's a mana substitute, but it is not an alternative cost. They are compatible. You can play Drill Bit for a 2 life and 0 mana. Now we get to an interesting one. Some of you may have seen the replacement effects uh, presentation, in which case you may have already covered this answer. But uh, if your cost is replaced, that cost is still played. But note that that does not mean that an impossible cost or a completely unpayable cost can be paid. I want to show you a couple of cards that look extremely similar. Sulfuric Vortex, a card from Scourge, says that each player takes some damage on the upkeep, and if a player would gain life, that player gains no life instead. Forsaken Wastes, a card from Mirage, so that deals some damage to each player on their upkeep and says players can't gain life. They look extremely similar, but there is a difference in the wording between their two life gain abilities. Let's talk about one more old card. This one saw some play back when Legacy Infect was a thing. I think it's fallen out of favor. It is a card called Invigorate. It gives +4/+4 to a creature, and it has an alternative cost that involves causing an opponent to gain life. Which of these enchantments, or neither or both, will allow you to pay the alternative cost to Invigorate? Seeing several people say Vortex, and that is correct. It looks like it's splitting hairs between players cannot gain life, and if a player would gain life, that player gains no life instead. But for Invigorate purposes, it does matter. Replacing 3 life with 0 life is still paying 3 life. Forbidding gaining 3 life bars you from cutting that cost at all. And finally, and this is the big one, and this is one that has shown up a whole bunch, multi-part cards. There's a few different types of them. Some of them are, one of them is very old, two of them are quite recent. Split cards, adventurer cards, and modal double face cards all have multiple parts to the card with separate characteristic. These parts are different parts of the card, but they are not alternative costs. That means if there's an alternative cost, either part can be cast for the alternative cost. So, can we cast Tybalt Cosmic Imposter with Violent Outburst? Not Kevin says, well, and he is correct. Just kidding. If you are caught off guard by this, sounds like everyone is in tune with this, but if you were caught off guard by this change, then the next slot, Elaine is going to be given a presentation on recent rules changes during the pandemic to cover this change, which happened about 2 weeks ago. However, the example that people are playing involves Tybalt's Trickery, and this one is a one that does work and is seeing at least fringe play in standard. You are casting a spell without paying its mana cost, and once you have found a spell that you want, you can cast either side. I'm actually going to talk a little bit more about what you can and cannot find with these effects as we get to the next section. But before that, we're going to deal with a few other things. Actually, I want to back up non-alternative alternates, flip cards, etc. before we move to the advanced thing. Any questions there? I'm glad you mentioned the ultimatum, Sam. We're going to talk about those in a few slides. Or talk about one ultimatum in particular. All right. So, like I said, at this point, that is the basics of the rules. We talked about the additional costs, the alternative costs, and the things that you might think of as alternatives but technically aren't. Now we're going to jump around to a bunch of corner cases and deal with some cases. In this case, one of the things we're going to talk about is color washing. What you spend is what you spend. So there are some effects that do check what type of mana you have spent. Um, for example, sunburst is one of these rules. There's a whole bunch of them. What you actually spent matters. And uh, you cannot just decide that because you got to spend your mana as any color of mana, you actually got to spend it. Also, a side note, copies, what you have spent on a spell, the type of mana you have spent, is not a copyable value. So, putting this all together, Grenzo Havoc Razor lets you cast spells with your mana as though it were mana of any color. Radiant Flames has Converge. It deals X damage to each creature, where X is the number of colors of mana spent to cast it. And Jin Illuminatus, we talked about, it gives you Replicate. This lets you repay the cost of a spell to get a copy of it. If you tap 6 mountains for Radiant Flames, you will get a single point of damage. Because even though you can spend it as any color, you can't say that you're spending red, white, black. You don't have that choice. And the copy had no mana spent to cast it and will deal no damage. This is the only time I'm going to read an entire rule to you, or at least post an entire rule on the screen. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I do want to talk about alternative characteristics and the last sentence of Rule 601.3e. It says, continuous effects that would apply to an object once it has these characteristics, those characteristics being alternative characteristics, are also considered when determining whether and how you can cast a spell. So, whether and how you can cast a spell, the continuous effects are determined by the alternate characteristics. What does that mean? Let's look at an example of what I call Schrodinger's flashback. A flashback that is not defined. The mana cost of fire and ice is 1 and 1 in red and blue when it's in your deck. This is a rules change from a few years back after nonsense involving Brain in a Jar. So it looks like if you Snapcaster Mates that spell, it will get a flashback cost of 1 and 1 in blue and red. But that is not what 601.3e says. 601.3e says the continuous effect, the one with the duration generated by Snapcaster Mate's ability, will define itself based on the choices you make. So, what does that mean about casting fire or casting ice with Snapcaster's flashback? Happy face from Ryan. And Toby is asking the correct answer. Does it mean that depending on what I choose to cast, I pay the appropriate cost? That is correct. You will pay the appropriate cost of whichever half you choose to cast. So if you cast fire, then the game will see that you are choosing fire and will retroactively decide that Snapcaster was giving it a 1R flashback. And if you decide to cast ice, then it will see that you're casting ice and will decide that the flashback mana cost is 1 and a blue. Now, I do want to talk about something in particular that is also a relatively recent change to terminology that makes things a lot easier to understand, and that can generate a lot of confusion on choosing cards versus casting spells. Some effects, I'm going to find cards and then let you cast them. Sometimes you will be doing this normally, sometimes for a specific alternative cost. But what's important about it is that when you are picking a card, you are looking at the front face of a dual face card. You are looking at the combination of that should say split cards, not flip cards. I apologize. Both sides of a split card and the default state of a card with morph and bestow. So, if you use Emery Lurker of the Lock to target Witness of the Aegis in your graveyard, Emery says that you should choose an artifact card in your graveyard, an artifact card note, and you can cast it this turn. Well, once we've chosen the card, we can choose to cast it however we want. And that means that it is legal to use Emery to cast the non-artifact morph alternate cost of Witness of the Aegis. But things work a little bit differently when you are looking for spells. Oops. Some things will let you cast spells at times and places you normally couldn't, and this may be again for the normal cost or an alternative. If it says you are casting certain types of spells, then you see them after all choices have been made. To give you an idea of how recent this change is, I could not actually find a printing of Narset that has her current text. If you see her, you might be confused because her old text talked about cards, but the current updated text as of the most recent Oracle, as of the most recent Comprel, says that she exiles 4 cards, and you may cast non-creature spells from among these cards without paying their mana cost. So what does that mean if Narset attacks and exiles Yorn, God of Winter? We can cast the backside for 0 mana, a few people have said, and that is correct. Cauldring the Rime Staff is a non-creature spell, and so you can cast a non-creature spell from among the exiled cards, even though the exiled card is a creature. So, with that in mind, let's talk about Emergent Ultimatum. Emergent Ultimatum says, search your library for up to 3 different monocolored cards with different names and exile them. An opponent chooses one of those cards. You may cast the other cards without paying their mana cost after one of them gets shuffled away by an opponent. So, what are we able to cast? Are we able to cast Valky, Tybalt, both, or neither? We can cast both. We can find Valky, cast either side. Doesn't matter that Tybalt is multicolored. Fire, Ice. Can we cast Fire, Ice, both, or neither? Frowny faces and nose, and that is correct. Fire, Ice is a multicolored card, and Emergent Ultimatum is using the card terminology, not the spell terminology. So it doesn't matter that Fire or Ice would be a monocolored spell. We cannot find it. Finally, Exalted Angel. Can we cast it face up, face down, both, or neither? Several people have said face up, and Elaine has got the specific reason. Morph is an alternate cost, and as mentioned before, casting things without paying a mana cost is an alternate cost. We cannot apply 2 alternate costs to the same spell. So since we are casting Exalted Angel for free, casting it face up is our only choice. All right. And last but not least is the last but not least step of determining a cost, which is Trinisphere. Trinisphere is a little bit weird because it is unique in affecting the total cost. It applies last after you have made all of your choices for targets most additional costs, after you have applied any additional costs, and after you've applied any cost reductions, and specifically after you've applied Phyrexian mana. So, what gets around it? Is there anything that lets you spend less than 3 mana on a spell with Trinisphere in play? Delve, Convoke are the answers. You are leaving out 2 other things, but yes, replacement payments are paid afterwards. Not Kevin added Improvise. Also correct. Phyrexian mana is specifically called out as something that is chosen at an earlier step. A lot of judges have their own pet peeves and nitpicks with the rules, and that one is mine. If I, was the rules manager, I would find a way to have Phyrexian mana work like the other things. But as it currently stands, Phyrexian mana happens before Trinisphere. So the other cost replacements will happen after and can let you cast a spell for 0 mana under a Trinisphere under the right circumstance. Crick does get around it. You lock in the total cost, and then you go to make your payments, and then when you would pay black, you pay 2 life instead. Okay? So with that in mind, I'm going to briefly turn off my screen share. Actually, I will just go straight to my other thing and go to my Menti. Pretend you didn't see that answer. And if you will enter the code, Kevin, thank you for putting that in, 4280588. Once I've got a few more people in there, we can start the Menti quiz and see how this goes. The card is Dream Twist. It mills a player for 3. Its mana cost is blue. Its flashback cost is 1 and a blue, which is true. The cost increase is applied to any cost, regular or alternate. For the wrong answers, alternate costs, you are free to choose. If a spell has both flashback and escape, you can pick one. They do not affect each other. So, Intet the Dreamer. It lets you exile the top card of your library and then cast it without paying its mana cost, which is false. Bear in mind, this is a which is false question. The correct answer, 1 people missed it. You do have to know a little bit about your keywords here. Overload is an alternate cost. It cannot be cost at the same time as the free cast cost of Intet the Dreamer. Good time and learn some things. If you have any more questions, I will be hanging around in the chat, but we're about 3 minutes over time, so we are going to stop right here. Thank you and have a pleasant rest of your day.